Okay.
All right, so I'd like to welcome you all today to today's roundtable concerning literature, history, and the current war in Ukraine. And thank you all for attending. We've got a lot to get through today, so I'll keep my introduction brief. This roundtable was originally proposed by Millicent Slabodanka Vladivglava. And at the School of Critical Arts, we thought it was a great idea to host this event. It was important to think through the relationship between literature, history, Russian thought and culture, and the war. Today, we're going to hear from a number of speakers, mostly working in Russian literature. Oops, sorry, just. So yeah, most of today's speakers are Dostoevsky scholars, including Vladivglava, Luna Bistrova, and Henry Buchanan. We also have a sociologist of religion, Olga Rigas, who knows Dostoevsky well, and a PhD student of Millicent Vladivglava's, Laura Yakitsa, who is a Monash PhD and has studied Balkan nationalism through the psychoanalytic and phenomenological perspective. This panel has grown out of the Hegel reading group, which Nick Olbrich and Vladivglava have run since October 2020, in which they've hoped to reevaluate Dostoevsky's works through his relationship with Hegel's notion of history. Hopefully that's enough context for today. So today we have 5 papers presented and a summary by Nicholas Olbrich. After those presentations and the summary, we will have our Q&A. So as I've said, please keep your microphones muted until then. And yeah, so to start off with, please, everyone welcome Ilona Bistrova, who will be talking about teaching Russian literature in Ukraine during the war. So hand it over to you, Alona.
Hello, I'm Elena Bistrova from Ivan Franko Dragobich State University in Ukraine. And for me, the war began on February 24 at 8:55 Kiev time. At 9 o'clock in the morning, an online lecture of foreign literature began for the third-year students of Ivan Franko Dragobich State University. 5 minutes before the lecture, I received a message from the headman asking if we would have a lecture, to which I answered in complete bewilderment. What had to happen so that we didn't have a lecture? And received a terrifying answer. Why? There was still a meeting, but there was no lecture. Approximately half of the group connected to the Zoom conference. The students were frightened, confused, many were crying, almost everyone was following the news and messages from social networks online. There were also bombing in the Lviv region. Many students received reports from direct eyewitness of the bombing. Everyone was expecting some words from me that would instill hope, confidence, and everything will be fine. And I myself needed those words. Our next meetings took place already in the military regime. We continued to work according to the approved program, but there was a transformation. Now the students were asking burning questions to which I had to give many difficult answers. Interpreting the works of world literature, we were looking for answers to these questions. How could it happen that such a bloody and such an unjust war began in the 21st century? Why do the Russians hate us Ukrainians so much that they considered our complete destruction to be the main task? How to live after our victory if Russia does not disappear? And hatred does not disappear with it. Is it necessary to try to understand the position of the Russians? How then should one relate the Russian culture, and which is main thing for me, to Russian literature, because such an immoral, inhuman, and cruel nation has grown up in its waters. Among the works with which we worked as part of the program on foreign literature on 19th and 20th century, there are works by various national writers. Already after the start of the war, we interpreted, for example, the fairy tale The Snow Queen by Andersen. The students and I analyzed the motive of age initiation in the fairy tales and the problem of national codes in folklore. To demonstrate how national codes in a folklore tales can indicate the aggression and militarism of an entire people, I asked students to additionally read such Russian folk tales as Ivan the Cow's son, and the peasant's son, and the serpent Gorinich, excuse me, which contain aggressions and a willingness to fight with other countries on their territory. That is, in fair tales, there is no attack on Russia, and therefore the people stood up for defense. In this and other Russian fairy tales, an attack on another distant country may be just because they knew the past that that distant country can attack. This is very much in line with today's reality. Russian propaganda actively promoted the news that Ukraine was planning an attack. The whole world knows that is a lie. In addition, in Russian fairy tales, unlike European ones, there is a frequent motif of passive age-related initiation, where the hero grows up without passing tests, without showing identity, without making efforts. The hero overcomes the obstacles traditional for this type of fairy tale, either by showing patience, or for him, these obstacles are overcome by his assistants. The main thing is to endure and be submissive, and you will be grateful. This also explains many of realities of contemporary Russia. They are accustomed to endure without protesting. On this topic, I later read an open inter-university lecture, the genre of fairy tale through the prism of war. We had remarks work, A Time to Live and A Time to Die. After reading this novel, the students said that they were amazed at its relevance. Only instead of the Germans, they set up the Russians, and instead the Russians, the collective name of the people who opposed to German army, the students set up the Ukrainians. The hero of Remark's novel thought that the war would go on in foreign territory, but it turns out that the war unleashed by Germany destroyed this home with a loving mother and the checkered tablecloth. Since Russian literature is included in our program of foreign literature, it is given an equal place among other national literature. My program includes Fyodor Dostoevsky's landmark novel Crime and Punishment. Starting from February 24, a powerful wave arose in the Ukrainian media space with a call to abandon Russian culture and language. The study of Dostoevsky's work as a part of my course also concluded with this wave. The students asked a topical question for these days. Why should we study this Dostoevsky when the Russians right now are bombing, raping, robbing, torturing, tormenting peaceful people considering themselves to be the chosen nation and Ukrainians the fiction nation to be destroyed. The answer was not short and simple. I explained to the students that the Russians' domestic and foreign policy is generally the same of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Culture and literature have always been an ideological tool for the Russian government system and nothing else. Russia has never given a person the opportunity to be free. And if a person was talented in any field of art or science, when he was controlled, then he was controlled by special care. If a citizen, and especially a talented citizen of Russia, showed disloyalty to the authorities, he was punished in the most cruel way. Therefore, all significant figures in Russia were subjected to polishing. The writer is immediately agreed to create according to the ideological course or was subjected to re-education. Therefore, all Russian writers who are represented on the world stage wrote, putting their lives in danger. And this danger is not nominal. So the same Dostoevsky was subjected to a false execution for a fiction's trifling guilt, participation in the anti-government activities of the Petrashevsky cycle. Just think, they criticize the authorities. In Ukraine, only the lazy do not do it, and Dostoevsky was shot for this. I invited students to imagine that we, for example, meet in the evening in the park and discuss that the president is, our president, is doing nothing, a populist, no good, he should be replaced. And the next day we are all arrested, keep in a cell, tried and await not a fine or warning, but execution. The students looked at me with uncomprehending eyes. This is some kind of fantasy. This does not happen in reality. And in Russia, it doesn't just happen, it's the norm. My two grandfathers were subjected to such an effective method of education in the first half of the 20th century. The father of my grandmother, Lyudmila Krasnova, who raised me, was arrested 3 times for suspicion of espionage and sentenced to death for refusing to swear allegiance to the Red Army. Russia does not tolerate proud free people with strong inner morals. It breaks them or physically destroys them. The death penalty at the last moment was replaced by hard labor in the city of Kotlas with the confiscation of all property. He was rehabilitated only after the collapse of Soviet Union mostly. Many people who have experienced such a psychological impact in the future try to demonstrate loyalty to the current government and do not try to show freedom-loving views. The unreformed are eliminated. Almost all talented Russian writers have been and are being polished. Either you write the right way or suffer. No many are willing to suffer. The authorities went through the writers of the 20th century like a cast iron skating rink. Tragic was the fate of almost all the writers of Silver Age and a large number of dramatic creative biographies of the Stalinist regime. These people wrote not because of, but in spite of. Dostoevsky repeatedly showed imperial views both in his works and in his statements. For example, the speech of Pushkin days. I explained to students that this is the result of a moral trauma experienced after a pseudo-execution and hard labor. I'm not making excuse. I am explaining only why. I am explaining why. At the same time, the brilliant works of the writer show the smallest corner of the soul of Russians and show this primary to the Russians themselves and to the world readers. Many works describe a Russian young man who cannot understand who he is, what place he occupies in the world, understand his goal. So this is the Russian people, like Raskolnikov. These people believe that they were loved too. In fact, even in early childhood, people are told what is good and what is evil, how important justice and mutual assistance are. And you can't kill another if you don't protect your life or your family. Dostoevsky himself showed how it will end if a person decided to kill for some of his own ideological considerations. He who kills once, kills again. He is forever a murderer. And faith did not help Rodion to repent of mortal sin, which meant that everything can be repeated without end. This dominant is displayed in a large number of works of art and films. In preparation for the practical lesson on Dostoevsky's novel, I asked students to additionally watch Woody Allen's film, The Irrational Man, where the theme of ideological murder for the good of society by Raskolnikov is beaten. Only a brilliant director made one correction in Raskolnikov's story. Rodion kills the old, unbroken, hated by everyone, and almost immediately kills her sister, who became an unwitting witness. Due to the too short time between murders, the reader may think that the second murder was an accidental one in a state of passion and not Raskolnikov's transformation into the real killer, already committing the murder professionally. Dostoevsky experienced this nuance in transformation through the peculiarities of two methods of murder. Raskolnikov kills the pawnbroker, not yet a murder, with a blind butt of an axe, which is especially carried through the whole city, but used clumsily with the wrong end. But he already kills the sister in the right way, splitting her head with a sharp blade of an axe. Alien's first murder and the next failed are separated by a significant period of time, and the author also showed in detail how the soul of the person who committed an ideological murder changes. I also asked the student to watch a Death Note anime where the same theme is presented in motion. Dostoevsky is a brilliant realist who knows how to see and understand the reasons. He displayed, but did not create for imitation. He was a European-oriented writer, and his imperial tinsel was for his regime, unfortunately. When I tell my students about a brilliant realist of Russia, I also tell about Tolstoy, who showed a deep humanism in his views, but at the same time perfectly saw the essence of his people. So I invite students to read the work of Lev Tolstoy, Khadji-Murat, in which the writer described the imaginary military power of the Russian army, total stupidly and lack of professionalism of the leadership, coverdings a soldier who does not want to fight close to the enemy, but perfects to invade peaceful settlements, and that's it. That to destroy for no reason, for the sake of destruction itself. The pinnacle of vandalism and looting by the Russian military is the act of pollution, the only source of drinking water with excrement. For Ukrainian readers, this work can explain a lot. We are wondering how people can do what is happening now in Ukraine. There is the purpose of methodologically destroying everything what can be destroyed. The whole world saw what the Russia military committed in dozens of peaceful cities in Ukraine, terrible atrocities, mind corpse of muzzled children, raped girls shot in the face, civilians shot with their hands tied behind their backs. The Russian military is good at fighting against peaceful, unarmed people, but on the battlefield they have significant difficulties. Surveys of the hell of Russian army and refugees who returned to the liberated settlements said that Russians destroyed everything they could. Mass of evidence of the destruction of animals, goats, cows, dogs, and not even for food, just to destroy. Cows and horses were burnt alive in enclosed pens. Cramped houses destroyed or plundered property, exactly as described by Tolstoy. Russia has not changed for centuries. As long as it exists in this form, it will remain so. Imperial frenzy makes you forget about the humiliating life in total lack of freedom and take revenge for this humiliating life, torturing the defenseless. And this is very accurately demonstrated in the works of brilliant Russian writers. Among other Russian writers, I introduced Solzhenitsyn's work One Day of Life of Ivan Denisovich, written on the basis of biographical material received in exile or in Siberia. This work once again demonstrated that the Russian writer can look deep into his person and the world that surrounds him and show him that he is. In this work, there is also an image of Ukrainian from the western region of Ukraine, where I live, who in Russia are called Benderovцы, making a mistake in the world which came from Stepan Bandera, a fighter of independence of Ukraine. Solzhenitsyn described how quickly the prisoners in the camps lost their moral characters, radiated, demonstrated extreme loyalty, willingness to cooperate with the overseas in order to have small privileges. The writer pointed out that the prisoners were of various nationalities, representative of the entire Soviet Union, and the only prisoners who did not lose their moral characters, who retained pride and dignity, no matter how much they were in the camp, were Banderas, residents of Western Ukraine. They were ideological people, noble with unbending inner core. People who, regardless of the length of stay, addressed each other by their first name and patronyms. There is no reason to suspect Solzhenitsyn of bias. On the contrary, it was life-threatening to present a positive image of Banderas. I'm not supported of a ban on the study of works of Russian literature. As I have already indicated, most genius of Russian literature are victims of the regime who are destroyed for their works and their position. We did not have a ban. So in these early days, a competition named after Isaac Babel, another victim of Russian regime, is being held in Odessa. Odessa International Literary Prize Isaac Babel for the best story in Russian. This says a lot. But we live now in Ukraine and live until the moment when a Russian bomb falls on us and kills us. The war in Ukraine is now going not only on the battlefield. Every day and every night, the Russian army, having no success in battle, bombs residential buildings at night to kill more sleeping people, shopping centers and hospitals during the day to kill more visitors, schools, universities, museums, food warehouses, farms, wet fields. They are burning our bread, grown in spite of the bombings. Therefore, the wave of rejection of Russian literature is logical and natural. In our democratic country, no one can forbid anyone to read any writers, including Russian ones. But we will return to the question of which writers can be included in our program of education institutions after our victory. You can't let Putin privatize Russian culture. Victory for Ukraine, peace for the whole world. And I would like to say words of deep respect and sincere gratitude to Professor Slobodanka Vladimir for her steadfast anti-war position, for invaluable moral and material assistance to Ukrainian defendants in the struggle for victory over Russian fascism. Thank you very much. And excuse me my not good English.
No, thank you. Your English is fine. Thank you very much for that. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions for that. For people who've just joined, the Q&A will be at the end, so please hold on to your questions or post them into the chat. Next, we have Millicent Slobodanka Vladimir, who will be talking about Dostoevsky and Hegel. And I will just hand over to her.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm very grateful that Olyena Bystrova could be with us. We go back quite a number of years in the International Dostoevsky Society, and I was very glad to support her because she's very supportive of the refugees from Ukraine and is working towards the refugees, and all the material help that she's talking about, it all went to the refugees. It didn't go to her personally. I'm also conscious of the fact that for her, this panel cuts very close to the bone. She's the only one in the war zone. We are all outside, except one person is in the RF, the Russian Federation, but the rest of us are outside. So we don't feel the war on our skins, but don't let the calm and reasoned discourse that we are presenting on this panel make you believe that we are not seething. At least I experience tremendous rage every morning when I wake up and read the papers, and I don't need to elaborate against what. So without further ado, I would like to say that I'm also responding to some of the views Oljena presented in her paper, namely about the imperialism of Dostoevsky's Pushkin speech. I will be talking about Dostoevsky's Pushkin speech, but I have a slightly different interpretation of it and a little correction. I will introduce a Hegelian correction into her view, which of course is the prevalent view, the popular view. But anyway, here we go. The question of how we should read Russian literature arose after the 24th of February 2022, naturally for everyone from the whole world. How do we read Russian literature against the background of the daily pictures of carnage and destruction in the Donbass and elsewhere? Is this world history performance in front of us? My paper deals with Dostoevsky because of all the Russian and European novelists of the past. He remains a writer whose reception has not run its course yet amongst general readers and academic researchers. He is still interesting as a cultural text, generating ever new interpretations and meanings. His literary works still have something to offer to our contemporary world and need to be part of world education with its treatment of language and the loftiest human themes, the finitude of human life and the pathology of the human being. Dostoevsky also offers what he called a living human example. His example is that of a tragic life, political prison and Siberian exile, as Oljena also referred to, followed by a heroic struggle for the right to publish in Tsarist Russia post-exile after 1859 and carrying on a lifelong battle against debtors' prison. Out of this tragedy arose two Dostoevskys. One, the consummate artist, introducing Russian literature into a new modernist phase. The other, a journalist, trying to make a living by analyzing Russian culture and civic life in conditions of a repressive regime, to which he paid tribute by expressing nationalist, pro-imperialist, and right-wing views. Dostoevsky became a puzzle for me, a puzzle which I would like to understand in the light of the current demeanor of Russia, as of the Russian government as an imperialist, nationalist, and terrorist government. I would like to take a closer look at one particular aspect of Dostoevsky's legacy, his view of history. I would like to reread all his novels through this new question. What is Dostoevsky's view of Russian history? How did he represent this Russian history in his novels and his journalism? For today, I can only answer a very small part of this large question. It will be based on two documents. First, Pushkin's speech of 1880, considered Dostoevsky's testament about Russian literature, the Russian people, and the Russian national spirit, so-called. And secondly, Dostoevsky's analysis of the volunteer movement represented in Anna Karenina, published in a series of articles in Dnevnik Pisatelya, the Diary of a Writer, for 1877, which preempt some main points of his Pushkin speech. I will put this discussion in perspective with reference to the poetics of Dostoevsky's literary works. Of course, this will only be done in outline, in sketches. I can only sketch this in outline. I can't go into reasoned arguments on any of this, but I hope the picture will still emerge. I consider that the main context for Dostoevsky to be understood is Hegel, the writings of Hegel of the early part of the 19th century. Dostoevsky's view of history comes to expression in his engagement with the phenomenon of Slavophilism, which is grounded in the concept of the Russian national spirit. The concept of spirit, duch, is not naive and not an arbitrary metaphor. It belongs to Hegel's philosophy of history and history of philosophy, which are connected, as well as the dialectic of meaning developed by Hegel in his phenomenology of spirit in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. Dostoevsky, who had a declared and documented interest in Hegel during his Siberian exile in 1854, appropriated the concept of national spirit, narodny duch, and other aspects of Hegel's Berlin lectures on the philosophy of history. In particular, in his poetics, Dostoevsky assimilated the notion of history as genealogy, which is a perspective on history displayed by Hegel. It is history not as past, but as a discourse in the present, history as a slice of reality through the perspective of the present moment in time. Dostoevsky's artistic aim of representing Russian contemporary life, or as he said, tekushchaya жизнь, was grounded in his particular method of studying Russian civil society. He took facts from everyday life, gleaned from newspapers, social and political events, and treated these facts as ideas of Russian society about itself. In other words, Dostoevsky introduced self-consciousness into the perception of the Russian historical moment, framing this moment in a new novelistic structure called the polyphonic novel. This is an essential point about Dostoevsky's creative legacy, that form and content always go hand in hand in his aesthetics. That is why interpretations of Dostoevsky's so-called views about anything, history, God, morality, etc., cannot be extracted from the content of his novels without taking into account the form of his novels. The chief social question of the day for Dostoevsky and for his contemporaries was the relation of Russian history to European history and European civilization. This was also the question which animated the so-called opposing camps of Russian social thought and public discourse, the Slavophiles and the Westernizers. The question of Europe and Russia fed on the widespread familiarity with and influence of Hegel's ideas about the historical backwardness of the Slavic peoples, including the Russians, in comparison with the Germanic peoples. This was both a challenge and a provocation to the Russian intellectuals of the 19th century. Hegel's discourse penetrated the Russian intellectual scene, but was assimilated through a peculiar Russian discourse, which was not strictly philosophical or not on the same degree of abstractness as Hegel's discourse. Hegel's dialectic of history was hard to understand, even harder to assimilate, and impossible to imitate. The main concept of Hegel's philosophy of history is spirit, Geist, in whose domain world history occurs. These are Hegel's terms. I'm using all these Hegel's terms: world history, world historical process. The starting point for a definition of spirit is freedom. Quote from the Alvarado revised translation: the nature of spirit may be understood by a glance at its direct opposite. As the essence of matter is gravity, so, on the other hand, may we affirm that the substance of or essence of spirit is freedom, unquote. There follows a dialectical explanation of the concept of freedom and its connection to spirit and world history in their dynamic relation. Quote, spirit, by contrast with matter, may be defined as that which has its center in itself. It has not a unity outside itself, but has already found it. It is in itself and with itself. Matter has the essence outside itself. Spirit is being with itself, das bei sich selbst sein. Now, this is freedom. When I am dependent, my being is referred to something else, which I am not. I cannot be apart from something external. I am free, on the contrary, when I am with myself. This being with itself of spirit is none other than self-consciousness, consciousness of oneself. It may be said of world history that it is the exhibition of spirit as spirit processes the knowledge of itself as it is in itself, unquote. Self-consciousness and freedom have their roots in religion, according to Hegel's model of history. But the one religion which is singled out in the world historical process is Christianity, not as doctrine or belief, but as Christian principle of self-consciousness. Hegel stresses that there is a distinction between a principle and its application. His philosophy of history is an in-principle analysis, not an applied historiography. Dostoevsky, along with many of his contemporaries, found Hegel's model of historical development seductive and attractive. He adopted and adapted the concept of spirit, but unlike Hegel, Dostoevsky did not keep this concept strictly in the domain of principle. Instead, he tried to apply it in the practice of evaluating Russia's historical development, and in this applied process, forfeited some of the abstract or metaphysical quality of Hegel's concept. The result was his pochva, or soil doctrine, which merges with his understanding of and belief in Slavophilism. His Pushkin speech is a repository of both concepts. The Pushkin speech is a kind of summation of Dostoevsky's lifelong attempt to map Russia's historical destiny in terms not of a prophetic future, but a genealogical diagnosis of its current moment, while trying to read this moment through the notion of an absolute called by Dostoevsky after Hegel, Dapre Hegel, vjekovečni narodni duh, the age-old national spirit. Dostoevsky diagnoses this national spirit first emerged in Russian historical consciousness with Pushkin, who therefore ushered in the mode of philosophical history, which is Hegel's most mature stage of historical self-awareness of a people in the development of Russian civilization in the world historical process. So it all starts with Pushkin. Pushkin starts to puts Russia into this phase of historical development, which Hegel considers be the phase of a nation in self-consciousness, in spirit. According to Dostoevsky's own summary, published subsequently in the Diary of a Writer for 1880, the two main points of his speech were Pushkin's ability to absorb and represent the national spirit of other peoples, as it were to enter into the national spirit of other nations, which was called перевоплощение, which no other world writer displayed, not even Shakespeare or Schiller. And the second point he made, that this empathetic response to the cultures of other nations emanated wholly from a Russian national spirit, which Pushkin represented, and who, as a result, was deserving of the title of national poet. Thus, Pushkin brought to expression the universal resonance or responsiveness called всеотзывчивость and all-embracing worldliness called всемирность of Russian culture. These capacities emanated from the national spirit. Способность эта выходит из народного духа. These code words and phrases, всеотзывчивость and capacity for transformations, assuming the identity of another nation's spirit, перевоплощение, these are ideologams, not technical terms of literary criticism. Although widely adopted as textbook truths in the Soviet period, these terms do not offer the key to Pushkin's creative writing or his poetics. And you have to believe me this at this stage. I wrote my master's thesis at the University of Melbourne on precisely this subject. And however, there's no time to go into Pushkin's writings or Pushkin's politics, but I can assure you they're not перевоплощение. They are republicanism. These ideologams demonstrate Dostoevsky's attempt to construct an equivalent discourse to match Hegel's discourse on Geist as a historical force which comes to expression through the national spirit, which is the national spirit, which is, according to Hegel, the cultural totality of a people, manifesting itself through the ages, through concrete particulars which define every particular age. So there is no, whole total spirit which is there for all ages. It sort of manifests itself as the historical process continues to manifest itself. What Dostoevsky formulated as Pushkin's empathy and ability to reproduce the spirit of other nations points to Pushkin's sensitivity to European aesthetics and the historical genres of European literatures, which could be regarded as national discourses. Pushkin is the first Russian writer to transpose en masse the genres of European literature into a Russian idiom and to create a modern Russian literary discourse which showed a seamless assimilation of European discourses of the age of Romanticism and early realism. Dostoevsky was himself a master at intuiting such aesthetic discourses, which he transformed into a Russian aesthetics in the poetics of his novels. There is no other imitative or penetrative ability discernible in the various works in which other nations figure in Pushkin's poetry and prose. For example, this example is always trotted out, Pir во время чумы. Nor is it possible to fathom what the national spirit of so many different other nations would be, because world culture at any given period is an amalgam of intertextualities. It is when Russian literature becomes intertextual with Pushkin that it entered the spirit of world history. And by the way, I'm not such a follower of Hegel. I'm not a blind follower of Hegel, because Hegel did not read Russian and he did not know about Pushkin. So that led to some of his wrong inferences about the Slavic people and the Russian people and Russian culture. To clarify this idea of the transposition of concepts from one national discourse into another, let us pause for a moment to compare the analytic of Geist in Hegel's philosophical discourse with Dostoevsky's analytic of the superfluous man, Nizhny Человек, or the Onegin type in Russian culture. It will demonstrate what Dostoevsky had to contend with when he tried to transpose the concept of Geist into Russian culture. According to Hegel, Geist itself produces itself out of a permanent struggle with itself. Was der Geist will, ist, seinen eigenen Begriff zu erreichen, aber selbst verdeckt sich denselben, ist stolz und voll von Genuss in dieser Entfremdung seiner selbst. I have to read you the German because it's the German which is the key here. Now, this is the Alvarado translation. What spirit really strives for is the realization of its own concept, but in so doing, it hides that goal from its own vision. It is proud and quite enjoys itself in this alienation from itself. So my criticism is that Alvarado's translation is weak. It ignores the force of Hegel's expressions, particularly the expression ist voll von Genuss, and the non-standard German in the personalization of spirit and the concept of the expression was der Geist will, ist seinen Begriff zu erreichen. So these elements are left out of the Alvarado translation into English, which is sort of beautified, made easy on the reader's ears. Now, this is how I would translate it. Spirit wants to reach its own concept, but spirit represses its own concept and is proud and full of jouissance, Genuss, in this alienation from itself. Dostoevsky is receptive to Hegel's idea of alienation, but he applies it not to Geist. Instead, he personalizes it and attaches it to his version of Hegel's world historical individual, whom Dostoevsky calls a type. The use of type in this context is not inconsistent with Hegel's nomenclature, who also speaks of civilizational types. However, the lofty ground of Hegel's abstract concept of spirit and its self-production in negativity and alienation is left behind in Dostoevsky's transposition in favor of quasi-sociological categories of the Russian wanderer, Ruski Skitayets, who is alienated from his soil and the people, отчужденный от народа, от почты, because of his European education. Now that's the sociology of it, He's alienated because he's educated in the European way, as if the Russian authors were not educated in the European way. While Dostoevsky does not qualify the noun type, subsequent Soviet criticism did not hesitate to add social to make Pushkin's aesthetical and historical-philosophical discovery into a sociology with a new Russian social type entering Russian national culture. If we look at Dostoevsky's poetics, it becomes immediately clear that for Dostoevsky, type did not mean in his poetics a sociological type, but represents something more abstract as a direct borrowing from Hegel, namely a world historical individual, Welthistorischer Mensch. In a polemical discussion about ordinary people in part 4 of The Idiot, Dostoevsky's narrator mounts a critique of the sociology of typical characters as the vehicle for the novelist to express a historical truth about his age. Moreover, the chief characteristic of the ordinary people represented in his novel, Ganya, his sister Varya, and her husband, the usurer Ptitsin, is that they are acutely aware of their concept of what they are and are suffering from it, like Golyatkin, the first historical person in Dostoevsky's output. Thus, consciousness and self-awareness are the hallmarks of Dostoevsky's world historical individual, who is not a type, but is an ordinary particular, according to Dostoevsky's representation of the world historical process in his fiction. By contrast with his fictional representation of history in his aesthetics, Dostoevsky's interpretation of Russian cultural history in his journal articles of 1877 and his Pushkin speech of 1880 is reductionist, a concept which arose on metaphysical grounds of Hegel's spirit, coming to expression in a universal movement called by Hegel the world historical process, is transposed into a separate and exclusive national history, and how it comes to expression in that separate development through national historical stereotypes, generalized as the Russian superfluous man phenomenon. What this transposition of concept shows is that unlike German philosophical discourse, the Russian discourse on intellectual and cultural history did not offer the same possibilities of abstraction, of conceptualization, as did German phenomenology. In fact, and some people here may want to contest this, I'm happy if you want to contest this, but I will say it anyway. In fact, phenomenology as a philosophical trend was unknown in Russia of the first half of the 19th century and appeared on the Russian intellectual scene only in the last quarter of the century with the advent of Russian modernism and the evolution of new philological sciences represented by Russian formalism, amongst others, as well as the Russian developmental psychology of Pavel Florensky and Lev Vygotsky, although with Florensky we have a touch of Christianity as well. Thus, in defining spirit, Hegel speaks of the function of alienation and Fremdung of spirit from itself on the path to attaining its concept, Begriff, while Dostoevsky analyzes Pushkin's fictional characters as a substitute for the abstract actants of Hegel's metaphysics of history in the context of the concept of Narodny Duch, national spirit, which is not further defined on any level, and relates alienation to a concrete sociological practice, the acquisition of a European education. The phrase alienation from the people and the soil, отчуждение от народа, от почвы, represents a reductionist adaptation of Hegel's idea that the historical process requires a degree of alienation in order for a people to come into self-consciousness as spirit. To Hegel, the encounter with another and the genuine engagement with that other, not in war or conquest, marks the entry of a nation into the historical process and separates a mythological past from a proper historical past. Dostoevsky's language is far below the level of abstraction and phenomenological analysis of Hegel's discourse, in his journalism, I mean, resulting in the creation of mythams and mythologames, which spread widely into the pedagogic process of the post-Soviet and post-Soviet period. Nevertheless, Dostoevsky recognizes the necessity of the historical type of Aljeko and Onegin to the historical moment. Hence, they can be considered legitimate metaphors for a Russia in a phase of transition of value. Dostoevsky picks up on this in his own novels, by constructing heroes who are valueless, like Stavrogin, who is an empty center, or Mishkin and his female emanation, Nastasia Filipovna, who is mechущийся, restless, pathological, and without a grounding. Thus, while being somewhat reductionist in his polemical assimilation of Hegel, Dostoevsky is creative, innovative, and sophisticated in his fiction, where he constructs a new modern pathological subject in answer to Hegel's world historical individual in philosophical history. In fact, he constructs a whole series of these world historical individuals, from Golyatkin, Raskolnikov, Mishkin, Karamazov brothers, Arkady Dolgorukin, and others. Each one of these fictional characters is an anti-type and not an allegory, as my friend and colleague Geza pointed out to me. Each one of these is an anti-type, that is a modern subject of the unconscious, determined not by history, but determining history through his will and passion, grounded in his ego drive for mastery and freedom. Thus, in his fiction, Dostoevsky's view of history is very close to Hegel's philosophical conception of the historical process and the historical individual. That is, the modern pathological subject, which Dostoevsky is the first to construct in all its depth and breadth in European aesthetics. Have I talked for half an hour?
Yeah, I think we need to wrap up shortly.
Yes,
if you're able to.
I will not read the second half of my paper on Dostoevsky and Slavophilism, because this is much more difficult to read than I thought when I read it to myself. So it's difficult to read to an audience because the discourse is a little bit abstract. So I will stop here and thank you very much for listening, and I will circulate my paper later so that you can get the second half as well.
All right, thank you very much for that, Millicent. Up next, we have Henry Buchanan, whose book I remember reading nearly a decade ago in my undergrad. But I will pass over to him, who will be talking about Brothers Karamazov and socialism. Sorry, Henry, I think you're still on mute, Henry.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so this is research I've been working on for the last year, and it's called Dostoevsky Hegel, and it's about the sequel to the Brothers Karamazov. So in this paper, I'm going to suggest that Dostoevsky never broke with his socialist beliefs that got him sent to Siberia, that he only dissembled an Orthodox Christian faith, and the unfinished The Brothers Karamazov can be interpreted as a socialist novel, in which Hegel's phenomenology might be an important subtext. It's my belief that the proper study of Dostoevsky's writing is only just beginning. So in the preface to The Brothers Karamazov, the narrator says that a sequel is planned. Dostoevsky's preface says that a sequel will be the main novel, a novel about Alicia, and that the published novel is not really a novel, but only a chapter in his hero's life. Dostoevsky died before the sequel was written, but this would have been his next novel. This is according to his wife, Anna, and his Austrian biographer, Nina Hoffman, who learned from Anna that Dostoevsky had a continuation already in his mind. Other sources provide a glimmer of its content. The devout monk, Alicia, will leave the monastery after Zosima's death, become an atheist and a socialist, and end his life in front of a firing squad for attempting to assassinate the Tsar. This is according to A.S. Suvorin, a journalist friend, writer and publisher, who tells of a conversation between himself and Dostoevsky in February 1880. Of course, all this would have to get round to Tsarist censorship. And the third section, always in the hunt for subversive literature. The publicity of the first volume had spun the idea to the Slavophile readership of Katkov's Russian Messenger that the novel would amount to the refutation of atheism and socialism, and the monk Alicia was an eccentric but devout Christian. The narrator seems to confirm Alicia's Christian beliefs, enough to allow Dostoevsky to present a copy of The Brothers Karamazov to the Tsarevich. Yet a close reading seems to reveal that in the first novel, Dostoevsky was already preparing the way for Alicia to become an atheist or socialist. Critics agree that the passage that has most bearing on Alicia's future is his Cana and Galilee epiphany in the monastery after the death of Zosima. Christian interpretations of this epiphany insist that it records the rebirth of Alicia's faith in God. Yet a close reading of the passage just before finds a detail which would give his thoughts a more radical slant. This is when Rakitin, another monk, notices a profound change in Alicia and comes out with a rather incongruous remark that, hey, it's total mutiny and barricades. In his epiphany, Alicia gazes at the stars and gets a sort of idea that will change the course of his life. So I'm reading from the epiphany now. The vault of heaven, studded with softly shining stars, stretched wide and vast over him. From the zenith to the horizon, the Milky Way stretched its two arms dimly across the sky. The fresh, motionless still night enfolded the earth. The silence of the earth seemed to merge with the silence of heaven. The mystery of the earth came into contact with the mystery of the stars. Alicia stood and gazed, and suddenly, as if struck by a force, he threw himself flat upon the earth. He had fallen upon the earth a weak youth, but rose from it a resolute fighter for the rest of his life. And what is this idea? Well, go back to the first pages of the novel, to what Alicia dreamt in his heart, that Zosima's beliefs contained a power which will finally establish truth on earth, and all will be holy and will love one another, and there will be no more rich nor poor, exalted nor humbled, but all men will be children as children of God, and the real kingdom of Christ will come. So this was Christian enough for the censorship apparatus. But there are further hints and another small detail before Alicia's epiphany that suggests that this real kingdom of heaven will be a socialist society, on the lines of Zosima's earthly paradise. In this detail, we're told that there will be a break and a revolution in Alicia's life. Suvorin's obituary of Dostoevsky speaks of Alicia as a type of Russian socialist, and this would seem to corroborate such an interpretation. And what about this regicide in the sequel? This possibility is foreshadowed at the start of the novel when we're told that if Alicia were to find that immortality and God do not exist, he would immediately join the socialists. And in order to bring heaven down to earth, the earthly paradise, if that demanded an immediate deed, in common with the revolutionaries of the 1860s, he would sacrifice everything, even life. Now look at the sources and this interpretation in the context of Dostoevsky's notes written after the brothers Karamazov. First, here is a conversation between Dostoevsky and Suvorin back in 1880, when they're talking about a recent spate of assassinations and bombings by the people's will. Dostoevsky said to Suvorin that the public sympathizes with these attacks, or nearly the truth, they're not quite sure what to think about them. Then he outlined an imaginary situation. We're outside the Daziano Gallery, and we overhear one man telling another that he's planted a device in the Winter Palace, which will soon explode. Would we go warn the Winter Palace or alert the police? No, I wouldn't, said Suvorin. Neither would I, Dostoevsky. Suvorin records that Dostoevsky said he wanted to write a novel with Alicia Karamazov as its hero. He would make him a revolutionary, he would perpetrate a political crime, he would be put to death. So in Dostoevsky's post-Karamazov notes for January 1881, in his personal notebooks that are given scant critical attention, but which can be found in volume 27, page 56 of the Russian Academy edition, this blowing up of the Winter Palace figures again, and an article Dostoevsky is preparing on the topic of conscience and morality. For pity's sake, if by dint of conviction, am I really a moral person? I blow up the Winter Palace. This can't be moral. Conscience without God is a horror. It can stray into the most immoral ways. Determining morality must through one's convictions is insufficient. There's only one test, and that's Christ. After a digression, Dostoevsky returns to conscience and morality. This time there's no appeal to God or Christ. The act is moral, but not the idea. Moral is that which accords with your sense of beauty and the ideal in which you embody it. So two voices emerge in polyphony: the revolutionist who transgresses morality, and the moralist whose model is Christ. His meditation on revolutionary violence in these personal notes lasts for almost 200 words. It's a theme impossible for the diary of a writer, as was this thought experiment about the Winter Palace, but one that could have made into the sequel's regicide. Dostoevsky seems to be working out the relationship between morality and conscience in a new way, and seems intent on recasting it in the familiar formula of the major novels, Schiller's ascetics and revolutionaries. In other post-Karamazov writing, this time published in the diary, Dostoevsky shows an interest in contemporary Russian political appeals for an assembly and a constitution. More material which could have made its way into the sequel. This piece is subtitled "Crowning from Below" and is boldly opposed to what he calls crowning the evidence, that is, decorating the facade. This article pleads a case for the Russian peasant with his overcoat and bast shoe, not decorating the facade with a constitution. Dostoevsky dismisses this as a written piece of paper, not a pointless assembly. This is a chatterbox mill. No. Later draft notes argue these would be a mistake, just a European reformism. More bureaucracy would create a new class above the common folk and operate like a job creation scheme to buy off the intelligentsia with power. And in this, he anticipates nature. So Dostoevsky says about this, everyone's a boss over the poor and downtrodden. Now they'll have 20 more official bosses, he writes in his notes. In the article itself, he argues for foundations in the Russian peasant, a theme which anticipates a subsequent diary piece on Krylov's fable about the greedy pig eating up the roots of the oak tree that gives it acorns. Dostoevsky's opposition to facades in favour of foundations, roots, the downtrodden and crowning from below, and his post-Karamazov writing seems but a continuation of the theme of Zosima and Alesha's desire for a society in which there'll be no more rich nor poor, exalted nor humbled. Dostoevsky's powerful persuasive metaphors to champion the Russian peasant, combined with this hostility towards a European-type reformism consisting of chatterbox assemblies and paper constitutions, suggest deep revolutionary sympathies. Dostoevsky has certainly smuggled notions into Zosima's creed, so it's no wonder that the Russian censorship apparatus forbade the separate publication of Zosima's discourse. Distrustful of the paradise on earth, i.e. not in heaven, and suspecting that Zosima's mystical social teachings bore only a superficial resemblance to the teachings of Christ, the apparatus took the position that it was essentially opposed to the doctrine of the Orthodox faith and bad for the lower classes. Dostoevsky's stylistic virtuosity notwithstanding, he worked in the scripture, he wove in Church Slavonic, he read the hagiographies, he visited the monasteries. Zosima's teachings are still nevertheless susceptible to a decoding as a literary voice, as an inherent part of the novel's aesthetic structure. Now I'm quoting from an article by Slobodanka Vladimir in the Dostoevsky Journal, my favourite quote from this article. One does not have to be an orthodox theologian to notice that Dostoevsky's Zosima does not speak like a Christian ideologue, but that his speech is like a cipher, the decoding of which calls for a discerning contextualization in the literary historical rather than a literal Christian context. I've always wondered how Dostoevsky got Zosima's character. He lacks identifiable Christian sources. I'm finding these not in scripture, but in literary sources. In A.T.A. Hoffman's stories for Zosima's theory of the universe, in the psychology of C.G. Caris for his interconnectedness of the social worlds, and in Ovid's Golden Age for his earthly paradise. I also looked for the influence of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. This turned out to be fruitful for Alicia, for the influence of the stars in his epiphany, not God in heaven above, but a very modern stargazing. In the phenomenology of spirit, this is precisely Hegel's command to philosophers early in the book, that they should direct their gaze to the stars. This is the essence of Hegel's philosophy of history, in which Dostoevsky appropriates. At the start of history, in primitive society, in the golden age before the fall, man had a heaven adorned with vast wealth of thoughts and imagery, according to Hegel, and this governed his being. As knowledge grew, man directed his gaze to the empirical world, to experience, to worldly things. Science developed, but this otherworldly presence in the life of primitive man, spirit, let's call this the force of the universe, not God for Hegel, became impoverished as focus on the material realm grew. Hegel's command to philosophers then to direct their gaze to the stars might underpin Alicia's epiphany. It would also help to explain Dostoevsky's cosmic idealism and the value he placed on religious thought. Religion, with its belief in this otherworldly presence, is closer to the ancient wisdom of the Golden Age. Atheism, materialism, and science, they have lost touch with spirit, with the force of the universe. All of his life, Dostoevsky suspected a cosmic influence on his epileptic seizures, attributing these to the cycles of the moon. So Dostoevsky has written an article, The Utopian Conception of History. This echoes Hegel's philosophy of history, whereby the spirit of the harmonious Golden Age alienates itself in order to grow. Overlapping with the biblical paradise of the Garden of Eden, the Golden Age for Dostoevsky becomes a socialist ideal. Yet it would be suitably equivocal in facilitating a Christian and Slavophile veneer as Alicia transitions from an Orthodox monk to Dostoevsky's Russian type of socialist. A new golden age is the goal of historical consciousness, spirit for Dostoevsky, an age of international brotherhood. Trying to work out what else Dostoevsky might have taken from Hegel to back up the idea of Alicia as a socialist, I'm intrigued by Hegel's dialectic of flattery and rebellion. Individuals in the service of the state develop self-consciousness, but this is a form of non-identity, not a true self-consciousness, but what Hegel calls flattery. Self-consciousness for Hegel is only full when it rebels. So when Alicia looks at the stars, he's becoming the Russian socialist that Dostoevsky himself became as a young man. Dostoevsky refused service of the state, Hegel's flattery, that is, and rebelled. He dropped out of Petersburg's engineering academy to devote himself to literature, to a full self-consciousness, a complete ontological and epistemological break with the system. Readers who have noticed the preface identifying Alicia as a man of action, who's to take centre stage in the second novel, will project his destiny to merge with the atheist Kolya, an incorrigible socialist. And this would agree with the sources. A.M. Slivitsky, who helped Dostoevsky with the research for the first volume, recalls that he told a group of students at the Pushkin celebrations that he would next write the children. And this was to be a continuation of the Brothers Karamazov, and it would feature the children of the first novel as characters. So Kolya for Lena Gossman is an embryonic revolutionary. No one disagrees with that. Ominous then for the sequel is Kolya's expression of admiration for Dmitri's sacrifice to justice when Alicia joins him outside the church for Ilyusha's funeral. Oh, if I too could sacrifice myself for justice, I'd like to die for all of mankind. We have a glimpse in the first novel of how the friendship between Alicia and Kolya might develop in the second. When Kolya tries to goad him into socialist practice with Belinsky's belief that if Christ were alive today, he most certainly would have joined the revolutionaries. It seems like Dostoevsky's recurrent Belinsky theme will be played out again in the sequel. Kolya's revolutionary praxis, informed by Belinsky and the radical socialists, will lead to an attempt on the Winter Palace, with Alicia ending up in front of the firing squad, an ending which would agree with Nina Hoffman's report that Alicia is condemned by himself and perishes for the sake of others. Such a denouement draws on Dostoevsky's involvement with the Petrashevsky and his relationship with Belinsky. After 10 years, Dostoevsky reinvents, after 10 years in Siberia, Dostoevsky reinvents his image. A good Christian since boyhood, only went along to those Friday evening discussion groups out of literary interest, but was seduced by Belinsky's ideas on atheism and socialism, ideas responsible for his penal servitude. Irene Zorab charts how Belinsky became a convenient scapegoat in Dostoevsky's writing as he negotiated the censorship apparatus and increasingly sought to purify his public image, especially articles in Diary of a Writer. But as we know, Dostoevsky's subversive exploits were of his own making, and there's much evidence in his mutinous involvement with Speshnev and the Palm-Durov splinter group. A.N. Mykov's papers, for example, reveal that Dostoevsky and his co-conspirators had their own secret printing press and were plotting to set in motion a revolution in Russia. Dostoevsky's Siberian sentence was no fault of Belinsky. Unfortunately, the authorities failed to find the printing press or to discover the seditious intent of the Palm-Durov faction. Otherwise, his mock execution in Semenovsky Square would have been for real. But with Belinsky as an expedient ruse, Dostoevsky could dissemble conservative credentials, especially to the third section, who still had him in his sights, and devote his attention to the theory and practice of the radicals of the younger generation in the development of the revolutionary Geist. For Dostoevsky, this Geist, Hegel's spirit, had not reached a full self-consciousness. That is why he could condemn nihilist arson attacks and assassinations, and why he could sometimes share Slavophile and conservative opinions. If we exclude Dostoevsky's rough journalism from his writing, you'll uncover a progressive thinker. Underneath the mystical shell, there's a rational kernel, as Marx said of Hegel. Dostoevsky had to be mystical to survive. That's it, that's finished.
All right, thank you very much, Henry. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions about that. I've certainly got a couple, but we'll save them for the end. As next up, we have Olga Elena Rigas, who's an adjunct associate of the Sociology Institute at the Russian Academy of Sciences, and will be presenting on Russian Orthodoxy. And so I will hand over to her. Thank you again, Henry.
Thank you very much, and it's a great honor to me to take part in this round table. Thank you, Slobodanka, for invitation. My paper, my report is called "Russian Orthodoxy is a Terrible Force." The question posed of my topic is, should Russian Orthodoxy be cancelled in step with the cancelling of the Russian culture, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, or even the Russian ballet? Indeed, at the current moment, the highest Orthodox hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church are indirectly responsible for the events taking place in Ukraine, having influence on the top government officials. They do nothing to establish peace. The first thing I would like to say is that methodologically religion is considered as a part of culture, but at the same time the concept of religion is separated from the concept of religious organizations. In different periods of history, religious organizations can discredit dogmas or religious ideas. If we take into account the pro-war position of concrete church hierarchs and a concrete church organization, then concrete figures and organizations should be subject to counseling and the judgment of history. However, in the case of the Russian Orthodox Church, we can see that for the last 300 years, the Russian Orthodox Church has always supported all the actions of the state while losing its independence. At the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church managed to substantiate the civility theologically, relying on the gospel and the history of ancient Russia, or in another word, Kievan Rus, Kievskaya Rus. In light of this problem, for the discussion can be the problem can be formulated otherwise. It's necessary to cancel only the Russian Orthodox Church or all Russian Orthodoxy as a whole. And the first thing to note is the obvious shift of Russian Orthodoxy towards ritual magic, the replacement of rituals for everyday superstitions, as well as partiality to property accumulation right up to the Bolshevik period. I will give just one example from the historical description of a small monastery near Tver. Tver is located in 200 kilometers from Moscow, and the book published under the censorship of church hierarchs in 1896 tells us that the monks of the monastery used sepulchres stones from the cemetery to build a fence around the monastery, and at the request of the Novgorod bishop, they sold both secular and sacred items of the monastery. For example, liturgical gold and silver chalices. The money from the sale went to the maintenance of the bishop's house. As can be seen, the church hierarchs practiced Bolshevism long before 1917. When Bolsheviks began to seize church property and use sepulchres stones to build roads, they only repeated the exploits of the previous Orthodox bishops of the 18th and 19th century. Such profit-seeking Bolshevism has been going on since the time of Joseph of Wolotsk, 1439, and he lived in 15 and yes, in 15th and 16th centuries. Joseph Wolotsk gave the theological justification for ecclesiastical possession and the allowability of church luxury. It was the desire for terrestrial wealth and that turned the Russian Orthodox Church into dependence on the secular authorities, starting with the Peter the First. Therefore, there is another question: should the Russian Orthodoxy be cancelled, not only Russian Orthodox Church? It must be borne in mind that there were two types of orthodoxy in Russia after Bolshevik Revolution. I mean Stalinist orthodoxy and catacomb orthodoxy. Now an anti-war position is widely expressed only by believers of the catacomb orthodoxy. For example, by Bishop Grigory Mikhnov-Vaitenko, a son of the Soviet poet and dissident Alexander Galich. It is he who organizes assistance to the Ukrainian refugees in St. Petersburg. The catacomb orthodoxy is a silent revision of the common Russian orthodoxy. In the condition of the state persecution, the catacombers have refused luxury, state civility, and cooperation with the authorities, and now hold the divine services in sheds or private apartments. And with direction of Russian Orthodoxy is called an apartment or orthodoxy. On the another hand, Patriarch Kirill represents the Stalinist orthodoxy. From this union of the ecclesiastical possessors and Bolshevism, the philosophy of Yegor Kholmogorov takes its root. Yegor Kholmogorov established a philosophy of a nuclear orthodoxy. It means Russian orthodoxy plus a nuclear weapon. This philosophy ideologically fits the action of the Russian military leadership. In the philosophy of a nuclear orthodoxy, the ideas of Bolshevism are mixed with the doctrine of the ecclesiastical possession and inspire the plans of the Russian government to conquer or possess the whole world and the entire universe, up to the, for example, construction of Orthodox churches on Mars, planet Mars. The catacombers are the internal migrants who now spend all their efforts to help refugees from Ukraine. And opposition between the Stalinist church and the catacombers very well describes very well describes the situation of the current Russian society. Some persons use state privileges and only destroy it, and others use only their own scarce resources, create and at the same time hide their charitable activities. In former times, Petersburg publicist Tatiana Moskvina wrote about such hidden creators who resemble the folklore Kitish town, or in Russian Kitishgrad, an ancient Russian city that later sank on desert and still exists virtually. Now Russia consists of two parts, a visible evil empire and a virtual Kitish town. This town is very small, but its locals or dwellers keep the memory of all the significant achievements of the Russian culture. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, or a rocket scientist Tsiolkovsky. This is the tragedy of Russian history, when barbarian Moscovia and Kitish town have always coexisted. Moscovia is constantly canceling the culture and fate of the denizens of Kitish town. I will only mention the convict Dostoevsky, the poet Mandelstam, executed by Stalin, the persecuted poetess Anna Akhmatova, and the excommunicated Leo Tolstoy. Over time, Moscovia always declares the locals of Kitish town to be original Moscovites. In this sense, Moscovia always tends to Bolshevism, to appropriate everything that belongs to others, to reap where we did not sow. So, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church appropriated the achievements of the pioneer printer Ivan Fedorov, who founded the first printing house in Moscow in 1574. A short time later, the printing house was immediately destroyed by church hierarchs, and Ivan Fedorov fled to Lithuania. The modern Russian Orthodox Church, without revising the action of its predecessors, proclaims Ivan Fedorov an enlightener of Russia. And when the West cancels Russian culture, it only does so because the Moscovites have privatized Russian culture. Nevertheless, in this cancellation, the West first of all cancels the invisible Kitish town and all those internal migrants who don't have the opportunity to openly resist Moscovia or flee to the West. The only way out of this situation is the fulfillment of the prophecy of the Russian political scientist Valery Kramnik, who wrote more than 15 years ago that by 2050 only the Republic of Rus will remain instead of the present-day Russia. Also, he had in mind, first of all, separatism within multinational Russia, and therefore the inevitable collapse of the Russian Federation, but in cultural terms, he had in mind the inevitable victory of Kitish town over Moscovia, and respectively the victory of the catacomb orthodoxy, other the philosophy of a nuclear orthodoxy. So thank you very much. Excuse me, my short speech.
Thank you very much, Elena Olga.
The end.
Thank you very much. So moving on to our final paper for today, before Nicholas Olbrook will give us a summary and our Q&A will start. So next we have Dr. Laria Kitsa. She's a secretary of Cross-Cultural Community Connections and holds a PhD in comparative literature and cultural studies from Monash University. So she will be talking about Serbian nationalism and Serbia and Russia in the historical process. So thank you again, Jelena Olga.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers for very inspirational, very thought-provoking presentations. My presentation will continue not so much, of course, not on so much on literature, or Dostoevsky, but this will be in general about what about canceling cultures. What happens when in the times of political and social unrest, when a culture, any culture experiences any kind of boycott, isolation, what happens when there is a lack of communication amidst political sanctions, therefore isolations, and how vulnerable that very culture is to political misappropriation by its own regime. Okay, so so what is happening with the reception and the boycott of Russian culture in the Western world following Russia's invasion of Ukraine can have enormous impact, not only on Russia, but on the Western world too, if it distances itself too far. Apart from the obvious problem of limiting the cultural exchange, these kinds of measures can also lead the Russian culture into a type of isolation vulnerable to political misappropriation more than it has already been. In the 1990s, we had a similar situation, only on a smaller scale, in the Balkans after the disintegration of Yugoslavia and the ethnic wars that followed. As they proclaimed their independence, the newly formed former Yugoslavian states applied a rigorous censorship of ethnically unsuitable authors, together with the process of appropriation of authors from different states based on their ethnicity. At first, the authors of the enemy ethnicities were no longer available on the local market, while having been excluded from education system, namely school curriculums, with only a very few exceptions. At the same time, the authors of the so-called home, if you like, home ethnicities were in a way reclaimed from the other states, based solely on their ethnicity and not the cultural discourse of their work. And we have, for example, in such a situation, a Croatian school curriculum, which no longer included Simo Matavulj, a Croatian-born 19th century author of Serbian ethnicity, most renowned for his writing about life in Dalmatia. At the same time, Matavulj's work, such as his famous novel Bakonja fra Brne, remained in Serbian literary canon despite being written in Croatian or Dalmatian dialect, much closer to a Croatian reader and very difficult to understand for a standard reader in Serbia. So it's just a little paradox to show how these kind of what happens in situations of separating cultures, literature, claiming and reclaiming based on ethnicity. So this small example is only one of many which illustrate the paradox of nationalizing the arts by the means of boycott and ostracizing through the Iron Curtain of cultural wars on both sides of the conflict. While the constant revision of suitable and unsuitable authors continues 3 decades after the Yugoslav war, there is a bigger problem that occurs on the home front of a given culture, where a type of cultural isolation and introversion occurs and becomes a fertile ground for political exploitation. In the example of Yugoslavia, namely Serbia, the political and social turbulence of the 1990s led to a cultural isolation, which created a ground for revisiting cultural memory and re-establishing cultural identity, strategically governed by the political regime of the time. Of course, there were other factors at stake here, but this is just also just one way of looking at it, and definitely a very, very important, very significant event in creating a much more fertile, much more easier ground to manipulate the local masses. So without going too far into the detail of the political events which led to the disintegration of Yugoslavia, the rise of nationalism is one aspect that cannot be overlooked. In Serbia, the clear signs of nationalistic rhetoric are often identified in Slobodan Milošević's speech at the commemoration of 500 years since the culturally significant Battle of Kosovo between the Christian, mainly Serbian armies and the Ottomans in 1389. So here I say culturally rather than historically, because of a question of the historical significance of over the cultural one. This is a topic of a scholarly debate on many levels, for which there is no, unfortunately, time in this paper. So the significance of this medieval event lies in its role of shaping cultural memory more so than in its impact on socio-political landscape of the time. In its political and cultural isolation of the 1990s, amid the 4 years of economic sanctions, there was a lot of room for developing a new cultural identity in Serbia by reimagining the cultural memory through literature and arts. So this was done by revisiting a time in Serbian history, which was popularly represented as the golden era of Serbian past, namely the medieval Serbia. It had to go very, very far in the past just for the sake of creating a memory which cannot be tracked down to a singular individual memory. But we can talk about this later. So the medieval Serbia before the famous Battle of Kosovo. Historically debatable, this era of Serbian history is portrayed in epic poetry and folklore, with a nostalgia for the lost kingdom of all Serbs, hence the frequent quotations of the epic poem Propast Carstva Srpskoga, the downfall of the Serbian kingdom, in popular culture of the 1990s. So it could be found everywhere. The quotations from the epic poem, not from history or documents that are available. So it was done in popular film, in nationalist songs, even sport events, etc. So how successful was this type of nationalist propaganda? That remains to be seen, but based on the patriotic sentiment that resurfaces in the time of socio-political unrest, it did seem to work. And even so now today we have the official position of Serbia in regards to Russia's invasion attack on Ukraine is not really clearly declared, but it is very obvious and more than evident that the general public sympathizes with Russia. So the reaction of the Serbian public can be placed in the realm of emotional and sentimental, popularly justified by the public interpretation of the events of 1990s Yugoslavia and the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1990. Thus, the pro-Russian sentiment is a matter of what Latinka Perovic calls a folkloric understanding of history. I will see here if I can perhaps, I know that I'm under the pressure of the time, but time pressure. Am I able to share the screen, or if not, then I'll just describe in my own words. I was just before this presentation going through some photographs, just even if you just Google Serbia, Russia, protests, you will see masses, unfortunately, of pro-Russian support of general Serbian public with Serbian Russian flags tied together, but then a lot of them, it's a huge percentage of flags are from the Byzantine kingdom, Byzantine times. From there's an icon of Tsar Lazar, the hero of the medieval Serbia. So we can see how this sentiment of mythology comes through and is just alarmingly able to move the masses. So to better understand these and similar sentiments, I have conducted a more detailed study of cultural unconscious and the ways in which an already vulnerable cultural group can be manipulated into accepting historical revisions by reconstructing cultural memory. I explained this through the spectrum of psychoanalysis and formation of subjectivity through the concept of loss. So for more, so loss such as the loss of ideal times, nostalgia for the golden past, perhaps nostalgia for Soviet Union in this case. But for more details, I can direct interested people to my study called Kosovo Mythology, Imagining Serbian National Subjectivity in Cultural Productions from the 14th century until today. This is my PhD thesis from Monash University. But for the argument of today's presentation, I would like to reflect on the concept of cultural memory and how important it is in politically unstable times and in national crisis. I'll just go a little bit theoretical here in order to understand the significance of this and the times where we find, especially Russian culture finds itself today. Some early debates on the concept of memory include a differentiation between collective, so-called collective, and individual memory, while other more recent studies focus on the distinctions between memory and history, memory and mythology, and different types and categories of collective memory. The dichotomy of individual and collective memory has been dismissed by many scholars, and already in the third decade of the 20th century, we have Maurice Halbwachs, who argued that individual memory is not possible without society, and that these two terms are not mutually exclusive, but are instead closely entwined. Halbwachs writes, and I quote, that everyone has a capacity for memory that is unlike that of anyone else, but individual memory is nevertheless a part of an aspect of group memory, since each impression leaves a lasting memory only to the extent that one has thought it over, to the extent that it is connected with the thoughts that come to us from the social milieu, end of quote. When it comes to the memory of Kosovo battle, for example, in the mythology which it has generated, a similar principle applies. No matter how hard we try to pin it down to an individual memory, the Kosovo myth has for a long time been part of the social milieu. That the knowledge of medieval Kosovo could no longer be traced back to any memory other than that of a social construct. Halbwachs and Abi Warburg develop theories of collective or social memory, which dismiss earlier attempts to define collective memory as an, quote, inheritable or racial memory, unquote. With this, Halbwachs and Warburg situate the discourse of collective memory and collective knowledge of the past in the domain of culture rather than that of biology. Therefore, as Jan Assmann concludes, memory of a group or society is no longer seen as a mere psychogenetic trace, which was a popular belief amongst the scientists and scholars of the early 20th century, as for example, Jung's theory of archetypes. Instead, memory as cultural memory is a concept for, and I quote, all knowledge that directs behavior and experience in the interactive framework of society, and one that obtains through generations in repeated societal practice and initiation, unquote. In their research on memory, also Noah Getty and Yigal Elam analyze an article by Jonathan Frankel, who writes about national myths. And this is how now, this is really important, that how from that transition from and the gray area between memory and myth, and which according to Getty and Elam signal a reference to the topic of collective memory. In his work, Frankel, who writes about the Jewish tradition, shows, and I quote, how new myths of the Zionist society conflicted with certain elements of Jewish tradition, and argues that legends and national myths enchant the group psyche, and create collective subconscious, end of quote, which Getty and Elam interpret as Frankel's allusion to the notion of collective knowledge and memory. Aleida Assmann further also claims that history and memory are partners rather than rivals, and suggests that, and I quote here, the question to be asked is no longer merely what happened, but also how was the event experienced? How is it remembered and passed on to succeeding generations? This is perhaps what the authors and artists of today need to be, perhaps will be responsible for. Besides the debates on the differences between memory and history, some historians and scholars such as Duncan Bell suggest that it is essential to clearly distinguish between memory and mythology, since these two concepts, both of which are significant to understanding of national identity, can be in conflict with each other. According to Bell, it is in a particular discursive realm, which he names mythscape, where the myths of a nation are forged, negotiated and reconstructed, and as such used in recollection of collective memory. The notion of what he calls mythscape provides a platform on which memory and mythology can relate to each other in a theoretically profitable way. The very concept of collective memory has also been questioned in Bell's work. He therefore employs the term social agency, by which memory is conceived in a more limited and cogent manner. Bell sees a danger in overgeneralizing the notion of collective memory, especially that of national memory, which he describes as, and I quote here, totalizing mnemonic that forms the basis of the nationalist narrative. The alleged unified, coherent memory shared amongst all the people concerning their national past, unquote. He argues that if one is to speak about collective memory, one needs to call it organic memory, like remembrance, which needs to be distinguished from the nationalist attempt to impose a memory through those representations of history which are taught in schools, passed down in print, in art, and in music. So is this therefore then this is where the paradox of canceling Russian culture for the Western reader comes in, but this we can leave later to discussion. According to Bell, this is the main reason why there needs to be a clearer distinction between myth and memory. The problem is not understanding this distinction. For Bell represents the danger, the problem of not understanding this distinction for Bell represents the danger of slipping into the discourse of nationalist propaganda and manipulation, where the notion of national memory or national past is simplified and selectively recaptured through various practices, such as that of literature and art, for example. Bell's concept of memory as a social agency can be taken further in confrontation with the discourse of psychoanalysis, where the social aspects of memory are examined in the context of the structure of a cultural subject in the chain of signification. The connection between the individual subject and the nation has been explored through psychoanalytic theory in the work of Yanis Stavrakakis and Dominic Lacapra, for example, amongst the others. Stavrakakis approaches the topic of national identity in the context of creating a new European identity, and utilizes Lacanian approach to this phenomenon, arguing that national identity is based on an emotional bond, which is subsumed under the concepts of desire and jouissance. He also sees a close link between the emotional attachment to national identity and nationalism, of course. He argues that in the case of both, emotional engagement plays a crucial role, which he claims could not sufficiently be addressed by, quote, standard constructionist and post-structuralist methodologies. In his book, The Lacanian Left, Stavrakakis examines the present European identity or the identity of a citizen of the European Union, and argues that the problem or difficulty in constructing a European identity as a collective, appealing object of identification, and I quote here, lies in the problematic of what Lacan calls jouissance. He explains that European displays an inability to invest itself with this surplus enjoyment value that is needed on top of symbolic attraction and imaginary loss in order to create long libidinal bonds and long-term attachments. So my conclusion is a lack of cultural exchange amidst political sanctions can lead to cultural isolation, which obviously it does, vulnerable to historical revisionism performed through imposing cultural memory, which is a social agency and which helps create the mythscapes resulting in nationalism. I mean, perhaps a little too late, because we do have nationalism really strongly present in both in Russia, in Serbia. The concept of loss on the level of national identity is what empowers emotional ties to national sentiments, also leading to nationalism. So if we look at the events of Serbian mass support for Russia's war, we can witness the above described irrationality of emotional bonds to a nation, which is not differentiated from the government. Serbian masses seem to be entranced, like Bell described, by the mythology of religious unity with the Russian people and the alleged historical and cultural links, which in itself is a huge paradox, because even today there's evidence that which the Serbian budget can show today, there's no secret that 70% of investment to post-Yugoslavian Serbian development comes from European Union, whereas only 14% comes from Russian. If we look at it on more than a rational perspective, or more rational grounds. So it is purely this kind of manipulation with emotional ties is very dangerous. And Elena rightly pointed out also the role of Orthodox Church. And I would like to also continue this discussion in that perspective, because it is somehow so strongly linked, and that no rational argument seems to be enough these days. There's only still a small amount, a little hope in Serbian society, in contemporary Serbian authors who take more of a direct action. And we have, there is a really active, really strongly present Serbian author Vladimir Arsenijevic, who wrote against the wars of Yugoslavia, the downfall of Yugoslavia, who did try to warn us and signal out the dangers of nationalism through his novels. And him and just a bunch of his friends just went recently to Ukraine and delivered humanitarian help, knowing that there is not really, unfortunately, much point of trying to start a cultural enlightenment of enchanted Serbian nationalists at the moment. So thank you for this opportunity, and let's hope that this will contribute in a way that we all hope to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara. Apologies to everyone, we are running a bit over time, but we will have some final words from Nicholas Albrook and then open up the Q&A. If you need to leave, if you're short of time, please post questions into the chat. As I said, we're recording this, so hopefully we'll get around to answering them. But yeah, I will hand over to you, Nicholas, and thank you once again, Lara.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? You'll have to forgive me. I'm still recovering from a bit of a toothache. It's quite an intimidating task to sort of sit here at the end of 5 amazing presentations that speak to the stakes of the situation we find ourselves, speak to the significance of our question of how do we read literature and history in the presence of war. And there's, you know, something from all of these speakers that's worth considering. In my preparation for today, I happened to read The Snow Queen by Anderson, because I was interested in what Elena had said about the national codes. And one of the themes that sort of emerged from that was this idea of embracing eternity as being a means through which we can sort of free ourselves. But what does it mean to embrace eternity? And what does it mean in the sense of the themes of today's presentation? So I think one of the key themes is that we must avoid, for the reasons that Lara just enunciated, but also the reasons that Millie and Henry and Olga have also enunciated, which is the resistance towards the privatization of Russian culture. Nonetheless, war is a reality, and it's a really harsh reality, especially when we have so much evidence of imperialism and acts of wanton destruction. so I think that it's important that we choose to endure, that we find a way to uh, to embrace the complexity of a figure, for example, like Dostoevsky. As Slobodanka has said, Dostoevsky arose out of a tragic life as an artist and a polemicist. But that didn't necessarily make him a right-wing nationalist, although we must be careful. And this is a part of why we must read Dostoevsky in the background of or against the background of this war. Because if we don't, then as Lara has pointed out, he is entirely vulnerable and susceptible to being remembered only as a right-wing nationalist, and indeed in ways that are really sort of not based on the evidence. I'm struggling to think of the word, but in ways that are manipulative, in ways that are designed to create this kind of mythology, or what Hegel would call this kind of original history. And so one of the things that sort of arose out of Henry's speech that was very interesting was this idea of Alicia, his legacy being one to ultimately face the firing squad for attempting to kill the Tsar, or indeed for killing the Tsar. And I thought that another major theme here was the theme of orthodoxy and how confronting it can be to engage with an orthodoxy, especially religious orthodoxy, but equally, and I think that Olga made the point, nuclear orthodoxy. And we face both in this moment. So the idea that we are, through being a Christ child, we find the way. But what does that mean? And perhaps in Henry's speech, and hopefully in Henry's article, and I'm very much looking forward to reading it, perhaps that means that Christ would have bombed the Winter Palace, which is a very interesting, almost funny idea, but nonetheless, it's serious, because this is what Millicent is talking about when she suggests that spirit wants to reach its own concept, but spirit represses its own concept and is proud and full of dissonance in this alienation from itself. And I have my own thoughts on what Dostoevsky meant by the Russian Christ, and I will enunciate that elsewhere. But I think that in order to keep my time short and to sort of leave some time for questions, the significance of this panel is in understanding our present moment, why the stakes are indeed so very high, and how we can maintain cultural exchange to the benefit of a sort of emancipatory universal history. This idea of world history is one that isn't passive. It isn't like the fairy tales that Elena outlined, where it just, as long as you submit, you'll be grateful. This is not the case. We must resist through declaring what is the emancipatory element in these writers, whether it be Hegel or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or many others. And I just, listening to Lara's presentation, it can be so narrowly focused onto one thing. And without saying anything too much, I would just like to say that that we're all vulnerable to these forces, right? That this isn't a unique phenomenon for one area of the world and is impossible in another. And every artist thus is susceptible to this problem. So why single out a Russian author here who wrote 200 years ago because of something that's happening today, when in 2050 it's an Australian author who's being singled out, or an American author, or a British author. And I think that we have to keep an eye on how we can maintain the spirit of freedom that wants for, as Henry so eloquently put it, neither richness nor poverty, neither where have I got it here? Neither rich nor poor, neither exalted nor humbled. And I think I'll leave it there, and we can open up to questions.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. So yeah, I will open it up for questions. So people should be able to, we'll try this at first. If it gets a bit hectic, I'll have to start muting and unmuting people. But if people are happy to unmute themselves and ask a question, yeah, we'll now open it up for discussion. And just want to thank again all of our speakers today for amazing set of presentations. So has anyone got a question?
Hi there.
Hi, Richard, you got the floor.
Thank you very much. I've made lots of notes here, and I won't get to talk to them all, but the first thing I'd say is thank you to everyone who presented. I was particularly moved from the comments by Elena at the very start of her talk, where she mentioned that her students desperately looked to her for answers at the start of all of these circumstances, when she in fact was seeking the answers herself, and what a difficult situation that was. So I just, I suppose, reiterate Millie's comments that you know, the difficulty of those circumstances is just, you know, beyond my comprehension. But you brought that home when you mentioned that fact. It would take me a long while to digest everything that was said in the presentations today, to put it into some frame, I suppose, and to let me take something tangible away from this, something that I can use. I'd revert to one of the questions that was posed for the roundtable, and this is probably most directed, I suppose, as a comment question to Millie, but I'm open to having a response from anyone. The question was, how do we approach the major writers of a nation which is committing crimes against humanity? And for myself, I've sort of split that into how and a why. And I wonder if my take on this is accurate. In terms of the how do we approach such writers, I suppose the first thing we have to do is be open to the idea that Russian writers still have something to offer to our contemporary world. And in relation to Dostoevsky specifically, we can understand his works by first understanding what he had to contend with, I suppose, in the process of transposing these sort of broader world views, and in particular those views as espoused by Hegel, into a Russian discourse. So I suppose, as Nick just said a moment ago, the how involves embracing the complexity of Dostoevsky as a person, of his circumstances, and then how that manifested in his writings. So that's the how do we approach these authors. In terms of why, well, I think Nick also might have just sort of picked up and maybe answered that. Why we do it is because we recognize that the present circumstances are so very difficult to comprehend, and the stakes are so very high, and that we're all impacted in or impacted by these circumstances. Why would we seek to understand and I suppose understand Russian writers? Well, I take from what has been said today, we do that because by understanding a writer like Dostoevsky and his view of Russian history, that in itself will help us understand something about this present moment in Russian history. And then we can more effectively engage with it and perhaps respond to it. Is that the takeaway from why and how we engage with these Russian authors?
I guess someone from the panel like to address this question, perhaps Millie, since it was partly directed at you.
You're muted, Millie. Millie. Can she hear us? She's Millie, stop. Stop. You're muted.
Hang on, Millie, you're muted. I'll just you should be able to unmute yourself. There we go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was going to say the answer is a big yes to your question. And I think we've sort of driven home that point as a panel. But what I would like to hear is what our Russian colleagues who are present with us think of some of the presentations and what is their reaction to our posing of the question. So I would really like to hear what they have to say. So I would like to invite Dr. Kibalnik to speak.
Yeah, okay. So Dr. Kibalnik, if you have a question for the panel.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, I have not been spoken English for a long time. So, I was quite impressed with the panel and with the start of the discussion. And I really have a couple of questions. And I would like to start with the question to Millicent. And of course, she spoke on the bigger subject, but I'd like to ask about a small detail she mentioned. Quoting Pushkin's speech, she said that she mentioned that Onegin in Dostoevsky's speech is portrayed as an alienated person, a person alienated from the people because of the Western education. And this is quite true, but at the same time, Dostoevsky regards Tatiana as a sort of ideal person, his own ideal, right? But Tatiana, of course, also had kind of Western education, and she hardly knew Russian. Она по-русски плохо знала и изъяснялась с трудом на языке своем родном. She hardly knew Russian and spoke with difficulties Russian. And my second question is addressed to Henry. It's a fascinating approach to look at Brothers Karamazov as a sort of socialist novel. It's quite new, but the question is, what kind of socialism Dostoevsky meant? And as far as Suvorin's observations, Suvorin's note in his diary that Alyosha had to commit a political crime, there is no mentioning of attempt to kill the Tsar, nothing like that. And Alyosha is a character which has very many difficult perspectives. Like, for example, of course, Alyosha is kind of, Dostoevsky's attempt to resurrect his own son, Alyosha, died quite recently in 1878. And it's quite well known that Dostoevsky was, of course, very sad because of, to say the least, because of that loss. And he went to, with Vladimir Solovyov, he went to monastery. And by the way, having mentioned Vladimir Solovyov, I have to add that, of course, as it's also known, Vladimir Solovyov was one of the prototypes of Alyosha Karamazov. And at the same time, Alyosha is sort of rebirth of Prince Myshkin, another perspective, very important perspective. And the elder Zosima is in many ways an autobiographical character. Lately, in Russian scholarly tradition, the Brothers Karamazov is really regarded as a socialist novel, but as a socialist Christian novel, connected very closely to European tradition. First of all, Félicité Lamennais tradition, and not Saint-Simon's tradition of Christian socialism, which is, as a Russian religious philosopher Simeon Frank mentioned, and Dostoevsky himself spoke about this several times, that Christian socialism would be better called as socialist Christianity. So there are many different perspectives in which Brothers Karamazov can be regarded. And I would add also, taking into account that Millicent also spoke about Dostoevsky's philosophy of soil, почвенничество, that in Brothers Karamazov's почвенничество, the philosophy of soil is debated and put into question, because even in the very plot, in the main plot of this novel, Dostoevsky would like to say that Russian people, even real brothers, still cannot have a true brotherly attitude towards each other. And of course, if the real brothers cannot do it, then of course the ordinary people belonging to Russian society still, according to Dostoevsky, are very far from this ideal condition portrayed by the elder Zosima, that people are brothers to each other, and everyone is responsible for the crime and even for the mistakes of every Russian. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Sergey. I'm not sure if did anyone from the roundtable wish to respond to that? Maybe Henry, if you had any comments on what Sergei said about Dostoevsky and socialism, just please remember to unmute yourself. Thank you.
So thank you, Sergei. Some very good comments there. You're right about Suvorin. Yeah, he does say it's only a political crime, but the enigmatic Z in the Odessa Telegraph, he's the one that says that this political crime will be the assassination of the Tsar. So that's less well known about in Dostoevsky scholarship. But yeah, it was a good point, a good technical point. I think you asked what type of socialist would Alyosha be? And you went on to elaborate that it would be some sort of Christian socialist. I think that would be the case, but we're not arguing that Alyosha would join the People's Will and be a terrorist. Somehow he would be drawn in to the other people's conspiracy, the boys, the children. They would grow up 13 years later and they would be doing the tactics. Alyosha would be a Christian socialist, a spiritual socialist. So thank you for your comments, Sergei.
Thank you, Henry.
Did anyone else wish to respond to Sergei's comment and questions?
I can just say that I agree with Dr. Kilbalnik's remarks about my paper. I did not go into the second half of the paper where I talk about Slavophilism, Dostoevsky Slavophilism, as it comes out in 1880 and in Dnevnik Pisatelя for 1877, and he's quite ambivalent. He's quite ambivalent. He never declares himself openly, I'm a Slavophile, He just talks about Slavophilism. There are three kinds of Slavophilisms. One is the class Slavophilism. The other is Slavophilism of the big ideologies. And then there is this mysliashi, a dreamer, a Slavophile dreamer. And he says, I belong to that category. He doesn't say I'm a Slavophile. He says, I belong to that third category of Slavophile dreamer. And he doesn't define what this Slavophile dreamer is. So the Slavophilism is almost like a red herring in Dostoevsky's biography. He doesn't use that as a concept, as an autobiographical concept at all. But I agree that and about Tatiana, I didn't discuss Tatiana in my paper, but I have a big section on Tatiana. You're quite right. She has a European education and no Russian education, and yet she's the symbol of Ruski Dukh, according to everybody's interpretation, as we assume she was meant to be by Pushkin, but we don't know. We don't really. Pushkin didn't say, "Oh, Tatiana is my symbol of Russia," But of course, she's a symbol of that Russian upper class of the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, when that Europeanized, she's an ideal, a symbol of the Europeanized verkhushka, top level of Russian society, which is now the self-conscious one. They are in self-consciousness. They are in philosophical history, in Hegel's phase of philosophical history, even if they don't speak Russian. Anyway, but she also says at the end of the novel, at the end of her speech, she says, "Но я другому отдана, и век буду ему верна." Now, why does she say that? She says that because she stays with the autocracy, right? She's married to an old general, right? And she's not going to take the revolutionary guy.
She said, no. I think she says that because she's Pushkin's ideal of remaining faithful. And Anna Akhmatova mentioned quite reasonably that Evgeny Onegin is finished with Pushkin's marriage on Natalia Nikolaevna. This is his ideal right before he's getting married.
I don't agree with this interpretation. Idealizing of Tatiana, you know, she's a symbol, she's a big symbol, you know, and of course, over the last 200 years,
Yes,
she has been interpreted as this ideal woman, you know, she's completely, you know, loyal to one man.
yes, but this is what Dostoevsky emphasizes, that she remains faithful to her duty, to her word she gave to her husband, and that is why she is Pushkin's ideal, and Dostoevsky is
We don't know that she's Pushkin's ideal. Pushkin was, you know, not so prudish.
Loyalty is hard.
This is a really interesting disagreement, but I think I might try and see if anyone else has any questions as we
Just
a
one
bit over
word,
time.
I think it's every man's ideal on the eve of the marriage.
Who?
Thank you, Dr. Kvalnik. Do you have a question, Felix?
No, well, I'm very pleased to be here and to listen to you all. There were some questions, but I would like to somehow digest them all to myself. Well, speaking about Dostoevsky and this situation, one might say that we are to there are some things that are in order. The first thing is to stop this awful thing, then getting back to literature and things and like Pushkin and Dostoevsky and so on and so forth. Though lots of things come to my view to reanalyze, and this Dostoevsky's diary as well. And there are lots of things that I used to share, for example, and now my attitude is completely different to the words of the writer in this or that aspect. But some things ought to be digested, so to say. Some scholars used to say, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased. All your reports and the panel was really great and challenging, and I'm impressed, really. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Felix. Do we have any final questions? Maybe one last question. Please try and keep it brief if there's anyone. No, if not, I guess we'll call it an end there. We've gone a bit over time, but I just want to thank again all of our presenters: Elena Bistrova, Millicent Vladivglava, Henry Buchanan, Olga Elena Rigas, Lara Yakitsa, and Nicholas Holbrook. Amazing discussion. I think, as Felix said, a lot to digest, a lot to think through. Yeah, and just thank you so much, and a special thanks to Millie for whole organizing efforts for this event. All right.
Very nice to see our colleagues from Russia. And we will be in touch. We will send you the papers, you know, because I'm sure you want to respond maybe more. I hope we will collaborate in the future.
I look forward to it. And all right, thank you again. No final words?
Bye, everybody.
All right.
See you, bye.
Hands across the water.
All right, paka.
The waters, different continents. Great.
Thank you for the invitation.
And very grateful to you all for this interest to Dostoevsky. Really.
No worries. Thank you, Felix. And all right, farewell, and thank you one last time.